restore the licenses of banks that were unjustifiably taken. You see, the significance of that whole thing is that those banks that were closed were the banks that held the investment of indigenous Ghanaians in the banking sector. Before, most banks were foreign banks until we encouraged Ghanaians to enter the finance and banking sector. And a lot of people like Dr. Undum, Dr. Kwabena Dufo, Heritage, and all those other banks that were closed put their monies in, got licenses, and UT Bank and all of them. And they ran successful operations. You see, those banks were the banks in the riskier end of the market because they were the ones doing SME lending. And SME lending is the most risky part of the banking sector. The foreign banks lend to big customers, the Unilevers of this world and big customers like that. And those lendings are not risky because the establishments are known and they know that they'll get their money back. And so you could expect that definitely the banks that were working in the SME sector, which is the riskier end of the market, will have liquidity problems based on bad debt and all that. But the answer was not to clean them out, shut them down, throw more than 10,000 banking professionals onto the streets, and incur a debt of 25 billion Ghana cedis when you could have resolved the matter with less than 5 billion. Because the reason for which they were closed was that they should increase their reserve requirements to 400 million. And so if 10 banks were closed, 400 million is 4 billion. So why couldn't Bank of Ghana give liquidity support to those banks, put them under administration, and make sure that they pay down the equity every year until they are able to repay the liquidity support? It was done in the case of, I think, the Bank of Scotland also. The British government knew the bank was going down. They gave them a liquidity injection and took equity in proportion to the liquidity they gave them. Today, that bank has fully paid. It's one of the strongest banks that you can find in England. And so I think that there were other ways we could have solved this problem without this knee-jerk action of just closing those banks. So I've said that we must restore indigenous investment in the banking sector, and we would give back the licenses of those whose banks were unjustifiably taken. There might be financial implications to it, but we must be prepared to bear those financial implications, because when government does wrong, it must restitute. And so I think that these are things that would look at with regards to the banking sector. Apart from that, not every bank must be a Class A bank. And so you can't say every bank must have a reserve ratio of 400 million, because they lend to different segments of the market. There are banks that are lending to small communities, and their reserve requirements should not be 400 million. Why do you need 400 million to establish a bank that is catering to a certain segment of the market? And so we'll have a tiered banking structure. For the small banks, Class C banks that lend to the SME sector, 80 million cedis or 100 million cedis is enough for them to operate. For the medium scale banks, 200 million cedis, 300 million cedis is enough for them to operate. And then for the Class A banks, the big banks, we can raise the reserve requirement even higher. So I think that that is what we need to look at.